All right.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us today on our session on agricultural contracting. We've got 3 papers that we'll be hearing about today. The first is going to be from Steve Wu, an associate professor of agricultural economics at Purdue University, followed by Annette Rummel, who's a researcher at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies, and then I'll be presenting the final paper. My name is Clark Lumberg. I'm an assistant professor at San Diego State University. So with that, I'll let Steve take it away.
All right. Thanks everybody for showing up on a Sunday during a pandemic. I appreciate it. So the title of my paper is Determinants of Relational Contract Performance, Experimental Evidence. And the basic idea, shoot, hold on. For some reason, my slides are not rotating. Here we go. Okay, so the basic idea is fairly straightforward. This paper investigates the determinants of contracting performance. And by that, I mean that there are really 2 questions that I'm trying to answer using economic experiments. The first one is, what factors drive agents to accept contracts? Okay, and the second one is conditional on acceptance, what drives agents to deliver on contractually obligated quantity and quality levels. Okay, so fairly straightforward set of questions that's fairly straightforward, easy to test using economic experiments. And the question people might ask is, why is this relevant for agriculture? Well, ag economists I've been an ag economist faculty member since 2001, and consistently, we see studies where ag economists ask the question, how do we get farmers to adopt contracts? And we may want farmers to adopt contracts for various reasons. And here are some examples. One is, for instance, development economists are often interested in how they might link smallholders in developing countries to modern supply chains. And that involves contracting, right? Convincing them to adopt contracts. Another example would be, I actually worked on a project where we were trying to figure out how to design contracts to convince farmers to adopt energy crops, new energy crops. And then I was also involved in a discussion with a financial institution that supplied credit to food processors. And one of the big challenges for food processors was how would they use contracts to induce farmers to adopt organic practices. Okay, so there are many reasons why, we're concerned about the adoption question, okay, as ag economists. Now, that's only part of the story, because even if you convince them to adopt the contract, you also want them to comply with the terms of the contract. So the question is, how do you get farmers to deliver on quality and quantity obligations specified in the contracts? Okay, so these 2 questions do have, real world implications and relevance, okay? Now, why do I focus on relational contracts? Okay, so relational contracts, for those of you who don't know, they're sort of, roughly speaking, they're informal contracts. Okay, they're not formal legalistic contracts. Now, contracts by definition are just agreements that people make, trading agreements that are meant to be enforced. Okay, so a formal contract basically is a contract that is enforced by a third party. All right, so what you need in these is you need very precise performance metrics that are credible and third parties can verify them, okay, so that courts and arbitrators basically enforce the agreements, okay? So that's, roughly speaking, what a formal contract is. But one of the issues is that not everything that the contracting parties care about can be precisely measured. And in some cases, things can be measured, but there aren't institutions set up to enforce these contracts. Okay, so I'll give you a simple example. In US boiler contracting, one of the things that the integrators want when they're sort of picking up the birds is that they want the birds they weigh the birds basically, right? That's a very easy thing to measure, but third parties are not present during the time when the birds are weighed, okay? So even though there are precise performance metrics, there's not an institution set up to sort of enforce the agreement, all right? And then of course, in developing countries, this is rampant. And I know a co-author of mine did a study on some Bangladesh water contracts. And in some of the villages there, actually, the parties they resolve the disputes themselves, okay? There's no third party involved, all right? So those are 2 examples. And so basically, nearly all contracts in practice have informal elements. Even when you have formal contracts where you have a written contract, usually you have a relational contract that's sort of not observed, but it's layered on top of that formal contract, okay? And this is certainly true of lots of fruit and vegetable contracts in California where they have written contracts, but if you speak to the actual people in the industry, they'll say, oh yeah, those are just floors. You know, we also, you know, do things above those contracts depending on the nature of our cooperative relationship, okay? So the other aspect of this is that repeat contracting is very common in agriculture. All right, so this repeat contracting is really important because it offers a mechanism for self-enforcement, meaning that the contracting parties don't have to worry so much that there's not a third party present because there's a clear mechanism here that they can still self-enforce the contract. So it gives them an incentive to use sort of informal incentives as well. All right. Okay, so let me just quickly run through the related literature. I don't want to spend too much time on this, okay, but just with a lit review by Jeff Mickler and myself, we looked through a broad range of empirical studies and found that most of the studies in ARE don't sufficiently distinguish between formal and informal contracts. And this is an important thing because a lot of these studies sort of include questions about trust and those sorts of things. Well, trust only matters in an informal contract. It shouldn't matter in a third-party enforced contract. So in terms of just thinking about the determinants of contractual performance, you know, you have to sort of somewhat distinguish between formal and informal contracts. All right. Let's see. Let me jump ahead to this. So there's been some empirical work in the general econ literature, and there was a survey by Gill and Zeroni in 2018, and they point out that there's sort of it's quite challenging to use observational data to study relational contracts because you have to have good measures and proxies of a whole list of variables like discount factors, reservation utilities, self-enforcement conditions, and so on. And I use a lab experiment here because this allows me to sort of control the economic environment. I can actually design the economic environment so that I have all those variables at my disposal so I can do the empirical analysis. Okay, and in the case in Wu, there was a paper sort of talking about lab experiments, and they point out that lab experiments are actually the preferred way to test general econ theories. Okay, that's not to say lab experiments are great for everything. For instance, in program evaluation, you want to use field experiments, but in terms of just testing general theories, lab experiments are actually quite effective. Okay. And I'm going to skip the last point and just move on to, I'm having trouble scrolling here. So give me a second to check this real quick. Okay, so let me give you a preview of the results. So just to give you an idea, so the theory, so I present a model and I sort of generate some predictions from the model, but the theory basically predicts that high discount factors and contracts that satisfy self-enforcement and individual rationality conditions reduce rejection rates and shirking by agents. Okay, so what do I find with the experimental data? I find the following basically, okay, that contracts that satisfy self-enforcement participation constraints robustly predict or reduce contract rejection rates. Okay, so that's consistent with the hypothesis or with the theory. Now, I only find tentative evidence, so somewhat weak evidence that high discount factors and contracts that satisfy those constraints reduce shirking by agents, okay? Now, I do find that there's a very robust factor that reduces both rejection and seller shirking, and that is whether the two contracting parties cooperated in the previous period or not. Okay, so this previous period cooperation is not explicitly in the model, but it does have some theoretical foundation in the sense that it's sort of related to the notion of best response dynamics in game theory, where the best predictor of current behavior by your opponent or your counterparty is what they did the last period. Okay, and in my data, at least, prior period cooperation really robustly predicted both of those questions that I'm examining. Okay, so that's a preview. So let me just go into the details here of the paper. Quick overview of the theory. The theory is just based on a very standard relational contracting model. There's no moral hazard, no adverse selection. I've abstracted away from all that. So the key issue is third-party enforcement. Okay, so the contract basically has to be self-enforcing. All right, so what's happening is the principal contracts, sorry about that. The principal contracts with the agent to produce a commodity or service. I'll just call Q sort of the key variable that the principal wants, okay? So I'll call it quantity or quality. So Q is not third-party enforceable, all right? So that's the key. And the principal's revenue is increasing in concave in Q, and the agent's cost is increasing in convex in Q. And then you got the reservation payoffs. Now the contract is so here's the contract right here. If you can see my little mouse hand. Okay, the contract is basically comprised of a fixed payment, all right, plus a bonus that's dependent on Q. The key thing is that B, because B depends on Q and Q is not enforceable, B is also not enforceable. Okay, so it's called a discretionary bonus. All right, so basically the principal has to design this contract by choosing the quality level that the principal wants, and then promises a fixed payment and a discretionary bonus to the agents. Okay, and the key is this discretionary bonus in non-enforceable Q means that the agent can deviate from the promised Q or the agreed upon Q, which is Q hat. And the principal can also deviate from the promised bonus. Okay, so that's where the discretionary part comes in. Okay, so in order for both parties to deliver on the promises, there has to be a mechanism for self-enforcement, and that comes through the repeat trading. All right. So here is, I'm going to skip over some details because of the time constraints, but the basic contract design problem, I mean, this looks like a huge mess, but I'm just going to walk through it real quick. Okay, so the principal, or the principal is optimizing over the contract terms. Okay, this is the discounted stream of profits basically for the principal. So the principal wants to optimize these terms and maximize its discounted stream. Okay, because this is a repeated game now. Remember. Okay. And then there are 4 constraints that are really important. These first 2 constraints are the participation constraints. So they're just the individual rationality constraints. In other words, the profits that both the principal and the agent get have to exceed their next best alternatives. Okay, so that's simple, straightforward, hopefully. The next 2 constraints are unique to relational contracts. Okay, so these 2 constraints are called self-enforcement constraints. They are not present in sort of the textbook principal agent contracting model that assumes formal contracting. These self-enforcement constraints only are needed in relational contracts or informal contracts. And basically what the constraints are saying is, so let's look at this constraint here, number 4, okay? It's saying that the principal's stream of profits from cooperating with the agent, in other words, honoring the contract, has to be greater than this payment here. So this is the single period payoff from not paying the bonus. Okay, so if the principal doesn't pay the bonus, what's going to happen is the cooperation breaks down. In the future, the principal then only earns the next best alternative, right? So this constraint is basically saying, look, it's better for the principal to honor the contract than to shirk on the bonus. Okay, so that's all that constraint is saying. Now for the agent's self-enforcement constraint, it's saying that it's better for the agent to deliver on quality specified in the contract than to shirk on that. Okay, so that's what those are the self-enforcement conditions. And basically, if you solve this problem and there's a sufficiently high discount factor, then you get a self-enforcing relational contract that's part of a subgame perfect Nash equilibrium. All right. Now to generate my predictions, those 4 constraints are really useful to generate some predictions for the actual data analysis. All right. So I'm not going to go through the details. In fact, this is one of the propositions from the paper. The main point I want to emphasize is in the remark here. So I'm just going to talk through it in words. This proposition is basically saying the contract must ensure that the agent receives at least reservation utility, okay? That's individual rationality. In addition, that the bonus that the principal promises has to be credible. In other words, it can't be too large. Because if that promised bonus is too large, then the agent doesn't believe that the principal actually pay that bonus. Because if that, for instance, if that bonus is higher than the principal's discounted profits, then the agent should not believe that that bonus would be paid, right? In that case, the agent would also reject the contract, because if basically what it means is, look, if the agent delivers on the contract but is not going to get paid the bonus, then it ends up making less than it would if it just had rejected the contract in the first place. All right. So the second proposition is that the bonus, now the bonus can't be too high, but it also can't be too low, because if it's too low, then it doesn't provide incentives for the agent to deliver on this contractually specified Q, okay? And then finally, if you combine the self-enforcement constraints, you get a condition that basically says the discount factor matters. It's just basically saying larger discount factors should theoretically support more productive relational contracts. Okay, so basically, large discount factors should reduce contract rejection, and increase or reduce contract shirking by agents. All right, so now if I were to take all those propositions, I can sort of put them together and get two testable hypotheses. Number one is that contracts that satisfy the self-enforcement and participation constraints reduce contract rejection rates and agent shirking. Okay, and the second hypothesis is an exogenous increase in delta reduces contract rejection rates and agent shirking rates. All right, so fairly straightforward, I think. So moving on, just a quick slide on experimental design. All right, so I recruited human subjects. Okay, these were university students. They came into a room and they were assigned randomly to be either principals or agents. And in the experiments, instead of the language principal and agent, I use the language buyer and seller because it's more salient. And then, so half the subjects would be assigned to be buyers, half would be sellers. And then they basically played an indefinitely repeated game with random termination. And this random termination is sort of how you actually implement an infinitely repeated game in the lab, okay? So within each stage game, so a repeated game is just repeating a stage game over and over again, okay? So within one stage game, here are the sequence of events. Hold on, there we go. So a period of the game starts, and then the buyer basically designs a contract and offers it to the seller. The seller can then accept or reject. If the seller accepts, then the seller chooses Q. And then if the buyer offered a bonus, now buyers aren't required to offer the discretionary bonus, but if they did, the buyer observes Q and then decides to pay the actual bonus, all right? And of course, the fixed payment is guaranteed by the computer. So that's roughly how they trade in the lab. There are a lot more detail, but we're not gonna have time to go over all of that. So let me move on to the next point. Okay, so with respect to the experiments, there were two treatments. There was a high discount factor treatment, a continuation probability of 0.8, which implies an expected 5-period repeated game. And the low discount factor treatment of delta equals 0.5 implies an expected 2-period repeated game, okay? So let's move on to some summary stats of the experiments. All right, so basically I ran 3 sessions of each treatment. There were a total, so across all 3 treatments, all 6 sessions, there were 110 subjects, 60 being in the 0.50 sessions and 50 being in the 0.80 sessions. Average number of periods, higher for the 0.8 treatments as expected. There were a total of 724 trading opportunities in this treatment and 707 in this treatment. And Now, our subjects were not required to make offers, but most of them did. 542 out of 724 here, and then 586 out of 707 here. Now, here's what's interesting is amongst the offers that were made, okay, in the 0.5 treatment, only 13 of them satisfied all those constraints that was laid out in the theoretical model, but 285 satisfied those constraints in the 0.80 treatment, okay? And then the total number of accepted contracts are here, all right? So let me just go on to some of the analysis. So before I describe this plot here, I'm gonna repeat the hypothesis. Okay, so hypothesis 1, remember it says contract offers that satisfy the self-enforcement and participation constraints lead to reduced rejection rates. All right, so if you look at this plot here, this is across periods. Okay, so each session had somewhere between about 20 to 30 periods or so, which is why this kind of extends out. So this is aggregated data across all the sessions, all right? And this is just the rate, you know, from 0 to 1, right? So you can see that overall rejection rates under self-enforcing contracts that satisfy all the constraints was 0.23, about a little over 20%. And for the ones that didn't satisfy, the rejection rate was around 1/2, right? And you can see across periods that held pretty consistently. Okay, so certainly the descriptive stats are consistent with the with hypothesis 1. All right. Now I also did some regression analysis, and these are the linear probability model estimates where the dependent variable is whether a seller rejected a contract or not. Okay, I also ran some logits, but the logit results were qualitatively very similar. In fact, the logit results are probably a little bit better in the sense that there was stronger significance, but I reported the LPM estimates to stack the deck against myself so that you wouldn't think I worked the data. And the other thing is it's simpler, right? I mean, simple is good. So the circled coefficients, I ran 4 different specifications, okay? 3 and 4 include seller fixed effects, and 1 and 2 do not. 2 includes a list of other variables. Okay, sorry, I'm jumping ahead of myself. The first 3 independent variables, the delta, that's the treatment dummy. So if a contract or an observation came from the 0.8 treatment, then this dummy takes a value of 1. The self-enforcement participation constraint dummy just says if the contract satisfied all 4 constraints, then that variable takes a value of 1. This is just the level of Q specified in the contract. The reason why that's theoretically important is because that's the main driver of surplus in the relationship. Okay, so a higher Q is more efficient. It's a more efficient contract, right? These 3 variables are not sort of in the basic relational contracting model. So one memory cooperation is just a dummy variable for whether they cooperated in the last period in the sense that they both honored the contract. Okay, so the principal or the agent delivered the promised quality and the principal delivered the promised bonus. Promised seller share is how much of the share of surplus was promised to the agent. And then one memory no trade dummy is just, for instance, in the previous period, did they trade or not? If they did not trade, then this takes a value of 1. Okay, so that's, hopefully that explains the independent variables. So hypothesis 1 is really interested in this variable here. Okay, so theoretically, these coefficients should be negative and significant. You could see that that's pretty robust across all 4 specifications. Okay, so essentially contracts that satisfy all these constraints robustly reduce rejection rates. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling here. Let's see if I can get that. Here we go. And the other thing is if a pair cooperated in last period, rejection rates are also reduced. Okay, you could see that here, okay, and here. And then finally here, if they did not trade in the previous period, then rejection rates go up quite a bit, okay? So that is the rejection part of hypothesis 1. Now hypothesis 2 also looks at rejection rates, but this is with respect to the discount factor. So basically an increase in delta should reduce rejection rates, but you could see from the chart here, you can't really, you know, it's hard to distinguish that there was any difference. Okay, in fact, the overall mean was quite close as well in terms of the rejection rates across the two treatments. And then looking at the regression analysis, okay, the linear probability models, sorry about that. Here we go. Looking at that, you could see that the coefficients across the specifications are all over the place. All right, in fact, only in regression 4 is the sign and significance consistent with the hypothesis. So basically, there's just no consistent support for the prediction that an increase in delta reduces rejection rates. All right, and that could just be because perhaps, you know, it's these other everything is operating through these other variables as opposed to directly through the discount factor. Okay, and then the next hypothesis is going back to hypothesis 1 about seller shirking rates. Okay, so basically contracts that satisfy all those 4 constraints should reduce seller shirking. And you could see that, yeah, you can kind of see that there is a difference, lower seller shirking under the self-enforcing contracts, and you could see the overall mean is quite different as well, 45% versus 72%.
Steve,
Looking at the regression.
Steve, if I could interject,
I'm sorry.
If I could interject, that's about time. So you've got about a couple seconds to wrap up.
Okay, so let me just say, okay, so basically the evidence is just, it's not that robust. There's some evidence that the hypothesis holds, but it's not compelling. Okay, and then the same thing is true of the discount factor. There's some evidence that high discount factor reduces shirking rates, but it's not compelling. Okay, so just to conclude, well, the conclusion kind of summarizes what I just said. Let me just talk. Actually, I'll just stop right there because of time. All right.
Great, thank you very much. And I believe Annette has prepared some comments and discussion points on the paper. And certainly, I didn't mention this at the beginning, but we invite any and everyone who has questions or comments on any of the presentations to please use the Q&A module. We're happy to field questions in that manner. So I will let Annette take it away.
Thank you. And Steve, thank you very much for the presentation. I also greatly enjoyed reading your paper. I'm a bit more from the applied rather than the theoretical economist side. So I also saw great relevance in this paper, especially because we do want contract farming to be used. We see strong benefits there, but at the same time, if we look at the literature and the case studies, contract farming schemes have been breaking down, and we also observe high exit rates or shirking rates of farmers. So going back into theory and understanding the basic contract theory, I think is very important, in addition to these context-specific studies that have a various set of findings that are very hard to bring together. So I think understanding these determinants that you analyze is very crucial, and I can highly recommend this paper to anyone who's even not that familiar with contract theory to give great insights and a great understanding of the topic. So I think it's very relevant and interesting. And the only comments that I have is that throughout reading the paper, I was left with some open questions that I think could be answered for a reader like me who's not into contract theory to make this easier. And the first one is that because I'm not particularly familiar with the state of the theoretical literature, is that I had a hard time putting your study and your findings in the context of the existing literature, regarding to in what way are your results in line with existing studies or findings, and in what way do they go beyond that and provide additional insights. And for example, you do mention that there are some credible and theoretically well-grounded theories, studies, but I did not quite understand what was done in that regard. So maybe you can discuss this a bit more precise so it's easier to understand. And the same goes for the experimental design and the theoretical model. And beyond that, I was also wondering, because I have I have no personal experience with the student experiments, and I think you make a credible case on why they are very useful in this context and why they are so promising. But at the same time, I was wondering what problems and limitations are associated and in what way they really confound the results that you were trying to make, especially on this groundwork. And that relates to the question of how the real life contracts environment could influence your results, which I'm personally interested because of the applied side of agricultural economics. And I was thinking about situations why contracts are actually important, such as the asymmetric information, even between principal and agent, that might be problematic, or types of market failures or a lack of market competition, in what way they would actually maybe influence the results that you had found, or in what way, and that would be of particular interest, one could actually model these influences in the information environment that you say can be influenced in such a setting. So I think that would be quite interesting to see if there would be any way to model these different environments in such a study. And just one thing I got really excited about in your paper is that you find how important prior cooperation is. And I think that goes very well in line with the current discussion of what potential farmer cooperatives actually have in the context of contract farming to benefit from each other's prior experience of trading. So I was wondering if you maybe would like to say something about that, or also maybe use this as an additional relevance of your finding. But thank you very much. I really enjoyed the paper. And I have learned a lot from your paper.
Great. Well, I don't yet see any questions or comments in either the chat or the Q&A window. So I guess I'll I'll use this lull to offer my own comment or question to Steve. Especially this prior cooperation result that you find, I think is really, really interesting. And I wonder if it suggests how I would tend to think about these repeated interactions, which is from like a game theoretic learning perspective. So, I mean, your theoretical model appears to be quite built out already. So I don't know if this is like in this current paper or if this is something that's worth theoretically investigating in the future. But whether or not, you know, you could embed this in more of a global game in which there are, you know, you have asymmetric information about the buyer and the seller, maybe some sort of trustworthy parameter or something like that, where these repeated interactions are eliciting learning behavior about the counterparty, which seems really, I mean, with my limited exposure to these informal contracts, really seems critical to the sort of mechanism through which these are, I guess, signable.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no. First of all, I want to thank Annette for reviewing your comments. I think those will be really useful for me to revise the paper, so thank you. But Clark, to answer your question, you know, I guess this model would run into a similar problem as sort of general repeated games, or even sort of static games, Nash equilibrium games in the lab, where people actually use prior period, you know, play to sort of as best to sort of say something about the best response function in some way. So it's kind of loosely, I guess, in the theory, but it's more in the general game theory sort of domain, where we're thinking about how do people form beliefs about best responses of the other party. But yeah, I hadn't thought about how you explicitly incorporate it as part of the modeling regime. I would imagine there would be some sort of a Bayesian sort of prior updating there.
Exactly. So that's
yeah.
So my understanding is that that's the global game literature.
Mm-hmm.
So you have the participants have there's sort of a state of nature that's unknown, and there's Bayesian learning through the repeated play, whereby the participants or agents are learning about these sort of hidden global parameters.
Yeah.
It could be something like credibility, or
yeah.
I don't know, something like that.
Yeah, no,
but it seems intuitively appealing, while also sort of your experimental evidence seems consistent with that type of behavior as well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no, that's a good suggestion. I'm definitely going to look into the literature a little bit more about, like what you said, those global games and sort of the learning games as well, to see what I can do with that. So, yeah.
Cool. Were there any other questions from anybody in the audience? And again, I think because of the format of these meetings, you have to use the Q&A module to interact. Okay. All right. Well, thanks again, Steve. Annette, I believe, will be presenting her paper next. So we'll let her get set up and see what she has to say.
Now you can hear me, right? Perfect. Thank you, Clark, and thanks everybody for joining us today here. I'm presenting a paper today titled The Effects of Contract Farming on Diets and Nutrition in Ghana. And it is ongoing joint work with Bethlehem Legesse de Bela and Martine Keim. And to jump right in, Steve already mentioned that contract farming is becoming increasingly important for various reasons that he had already discussed. And this increasing importance has led to a bulk of literature examining the effects of contract farming, particularly, however, on farm production and household income. And what is missing in these analyses is a focus on nutrition, which we have so far very little evidence about. So we do not really know what the effects of contract farming on diets and nutrition are. And the few existing studies that we have show that contract farming has the potential to lead to a reduction in the duration of hunger periods, can lead to a higher share of food expenditure. And for supermarket suppliers in Kenya, which is a particular type of contract, we also observe higher calorie and micronutrient intake. However, overall, this is very limited evidence, and we need more evidence, especially because the effects are not straightforward. So we, on the one hand, tend to observe higher household incomes under contract, which can lead to increased food purchases if available. But on the other hand, contract farming tends to also lead to an increased degree of agricultural specialization. And this specialization can lead to a decrease in the variety of home-produced foods, which is particularly crucial in contexts such as in Ghana, where households have a high dependency on home production. And in addition to that, we have few papers that also show that contract farming leads to changes in household labor and household labor allocation, which also tends to include female household labor. And that again can have an implicit effect on nutrition, because women are generally the ones preparing foods in these local settings. And in addition to that, these effects can always vary by context, by contracted crop, or by contract type. So we do need more evidence to understand the potential of contract farming to target food security and undernutrition. So the objective of the study is clearly to shed some light on the effects, to make some first steps. And we look here at the effects of contract farming on household and women dietary diversity and on child anthropometric measures. And to this point, we know of no other study that analyzes these effects. And in order to account for differences in contract type, what we do is that we look at two different types of contract, one being a marketing contract and the other one a resource providing contract. I will give you more information on that in a minute. Now let's look at the case study that we're investigating these effects in, and that is smallholder oil palm production in the south of Ghana. And here what we've observed in the recent decades is a very strong transition from subsistence farming to large-scale commercialization. And this large-scale commercialization occurred because large international investors started to invest in the West African sector, also partially because expansion was limited in Southeast Asia, and they developed huge contract farming schemes with smallholder farmers, who until this point had already produced oil palm, but rather on a subsistence level or for the sales at the local market. And in this setting, we're looking at two particular types of contracts, a marketing contract and a resource providing contract. The marketing contract here is offered by Wilmar International Limited, and it provides farmers with a secure sales market. So Wilmar contracted farmers provides them a secure fixed annual price and regular pickups of the harvest. Other than that, farmers produce entirely independent and have no assistance. Under the resource providing contract, which is offered by Unilever in a neighboring region, farmers have this secure sales market, but in addition to that, farmers have a provision of in-kind credits. And in particular, they receive planting material and assistance at the time of the contract beginning, which is generally the setup of a larger plantation. And then throughout the contract duration of about 20 years, they receive production inputs every time on demand. And this in-kind credit is paid back by the farmers through a share of their harvest, generally about 25%, until the debt is repaid in full. So now that we have the two contract types, which we had selected based on the contract characteristics and the geographical proximity, we of course need a comparison group to estimate the effects. And that provided an initial challenge for us, because we realized that within these regions with the contracts, we have no suitable comparisons. Within the contract villages, we barely observed any independent producers because almost the entire village had self-selected itself into contract farming, and a few remaining ones observed spillover effects. And the non-contracted villages surrounding the contract villages were purposely not chosen by the contracting company. So we had questioned whether they are actually eligible for contract farming from the company's perspective, which could induce a company-side selection bias. But then that the sector was currently transitioning, or at the time of the survey and is still transitioning, provided a great opportunity for us because more contract farming schemes were coming up. So we decided to select villages as comparisons that were already pre-selected for a contract farming scheme, but where the farmers hadn't received the contract offer and where the farmers were unaware of the contract farming scheme at the time of the survey. And we found a region with villages like that in a third bordering region with the help of the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in Ghana, who were asked to assist the contract farming scheme in the first place. And now that we have three groups of farmers in three bordering regions, of course, we need to make sure that they are actually comparable. Because if not, we estimate the effects of contract farming and they might be biased by systematic regional differences. So we looked at agroecological and socioeconomic secondary data at the regional level to ensure comparability. We held focus group discussion to observe village structures, and we also collected data on soil quality, irrigation access, and so on to also establish comparability at the plot and farm level. So if you look at the right side of the slide, you see this case study. In the rectangle, we have our three groups of farmers with marketing contracts, resource providing contracts, and the comparison area. And the overall 5 darker dots you see are the 5 large-scale contracting schemes in this area, and you see that they also surround our comparison area. And in these circles in the rectangle in our areas, we randomly sampled villages based on the contractor lists. And then within these villages, we compiled own household lists because we wanted to avoid any bias from the company side. So we listed all contracted households, and in the comparison villages, we listed all households that produce oil palm beyond subsistence levels, which means that they sell some oil palm at the local market or they manually process palm oil. And that led to a total sample of about 463 households. Now, we had worked with this data that I just introduced for the last 2 years. And we have already done previous studies. And for this presentation, I would like to give you some takeaways from these previous studies, particularly the ones that are relevant for this context. And the first finding is that we did observe that both types of contract did lead to an agricultural specialization in terms of a reduction in cash crop diversity, which is a common finding for contract farming, as I had introduced earlier. In addition to that, we find that the provision of resources through the resource providing contract also leads to a large expansion of the cultivated area. So farmers are cultivating more land that they own relatively, and they also purchase additional land to cultivate with oil palm. So we're producing at a larger scale here. And second is when we looked at agricultural labor use, where the literature had pointed out that contract farming generally increases agricultural labor use, we find that in the context of oil palm for Ghana, both types of contracts actually led to a reduction of more than 50% of the agricultural labor requirements. Now that seems like a tremendous effect, and I can also show you why. And that is because under contract, there is absolutely no post-harvest handling required. So we see on the left side that with a contract, farmers would harvest their plot at once. They would put the fresh fruit bunches at the farm gate, and here the company would come and pick it up in that form. Without a contract, you face a lack of large buyers. So households generally harvest in smaller amounts because oil palm is very perishable. And then they have to pick the fruits out of the bunches, which you see in the right picture, and either sell those in smaller quantities at the market, where the marketing is also time intensive, or manually process it into palm oil to avoid the perishability. So these are very labor-intensive steps, and they are generally in the hands of women. So we find that because these labor steps fall away, both contracts lead to a tremendous reduction in agricultural labor use, especially female household labor. But interestingly, we only find that the marketing contract leads to a reallocation of female household labor towards off-farm economic activities. And this is probably because the resource providing contracts households strongly specialize on oil palm and use that as their main income source. So we don't find any reallocation of the saved female labor time, indicating that they might spend time at the homestead is increased. And lastly, we find that both contracts lead to higher household incomes with a slightly larger magnitude for the resource providing contract. So now it will be quite interesting to see how these changes in production and labor allocation influence the nutrition effects that the household has. And what we look at here is first household dietary diversity, which we calculated over or collected over a 7-day recall. And we calculated it with the 12 food groups used in the FAO. Then we look at the women dietary diversity. And here for our study, the women we look at are the female caretakers of the children in the household. And we collected data through a 24-hour food consumption recall and calculated it according to the usually used 9 food groups for women. And then we measured child anthropometric measures for all children in the households between the ages 2 and 6. And we calculated the height for age and weight for age set scores, which are standardized by the WHO. So now before we actually estimate the effects or discuss the results of contract farming on nutrition outcomes, we need to talk about the potential endogeneity issue that we're facing in this setting. Households tend to self-select into contract farming also based on unobservable characteristics, such as, for example, their preferences. And because we have cross-sectional data collected in 2018, we cannot account for these unobservable characteristics. So we are facing a potential endogeneity if these unobservable characteristics influence self-selection, but also influence the nutrition outcomes. So we need to choose a model that allows us to control for this potential endogeneity. And the model we chose is the treatment effects model developed by Deb and Trivedi, which allows for an endogenous multinomial treatment, as we have in this case, because we have the two different types of contracts. And it allows, or it controls for this endogeneity by introducing a latent factor in the equation that proxies the unobservable covariates. Now let's look at it a little bit closer. So in the first steps, in the first step, it models participation, which follows a multinomial probability distribution. And we see here X as the set of exogenous covariates. In our case, we use the socioeconomic characteristics of the household or the respective individuum, market access and land availability. And second, we use an instrument. So for this approach, an instrument is not necessarily required, but it is recommended by the author, so we are implementing one. And the instrument we're using is the inverse distance from the village to the next large oil palm mill, and that is generally the contractor. So basically, we're measuring how far the household lives away from the next contractor. And now one could argue that that would be a measure of remoteness, and remoteness would not just influence participation, but it would also influence our nutrition outcomes. So we had to check for this, and we did check this among the control group also with the nutrition outcomes, but all the correlations are statistically insignificant. But just to be sure, we also include a remoteness measure, which is market access, just to capture this effect that might potentially play in the instrument. And what we observe in our regressions is that the instrument is relevant, and we do reasonably assume that it is exogenous and useful in this context. And then what we see next is L, the latent factors for each contract type. And these latent factors we see here in the second equation, where we model the outcome, are used for each contract, and they capture everything that influences participation as well as nutrition that isn't otherwise observed in the equation. So basically, the lambdas that you see here tell us whether there is a positive or negative selection, or whether there is a selection at all, and automatically controls for that and captures this effect. So let's look at the results with this model. And the first thing that we see here is the effect of the contract status on household dietary diversity. And we do see that the marketing contract has a positive effect of approximately half a food group, and the resource providing contract has an effect of approximately 0.8 food groups. And just to give you a reference point, the average dietary diversity in our sample is 8 out of 12 food groups, which is generally not very bad, but it really isn't particularly good either. So we have a higher household dietary diversity through contract farming, but we have a slight variation in the magnitude between the two contracts. Now, if we look at the effects on women dietary diversity, we see that these effects, first of all, are much stronger with 0.63 food groups and 1.32 food groups for each contract respectively. And they are not just absolutely stronger, but also relatively, because we have an average of 4 out of 9 food groups among women, also showing that the dietary diversity issue is much higher for the female population here than the household level itself. And what's quite interesting, what we do see here as well, is that there is an additional positive effect of 0.2 food groups if the contracted farmer herself is a female. Which is quite an interesting finding. And then we look at the anthropometrics of the children. First of all, let's look at the height for age score. And to give you a reference point, because these values aren't straightforward in their interpretation, we find that about 15% of the children in our sample are stunted, so too small for their age, and 10% of them are underweight, meaning too little weight for their age. And the first thing we see here in the height for age column is that the marketing contract actually has a negative effect on this this nutrition dimension, which generally captures a long-term effect. The resource providing contract, however, has a positive effect of 0.29, And what we do see is that if the contracted farmer is female, this additional nutrition effect is large enough to compensate even the negative effect of the marketing contract, which might also apply that the share of female contracted farmers are carrying a lot of the overall effect, maybe also on the household level. And then if we look at the weight for age set score, we see that both contracts again have a positive effect. Again, the resource providing contract has a higher effect, and we again have the additional effect of the female contractor. So now next we were wondering, of course, why we do observe such significant differences across contracts. And we didn't do a pathway analysis yet, but what we did is to look at some of the dimensions that are potentially influencing this here. So and what we first look at is the sources of dietary diversity, meaning where do the food groups come from that are being consumed? And if we look at the own production, we see that the households under the marketing contract derive much less dietary diversity from own production than the other two farmer groups. And this does not seem to be compensated by a higher diversity of purchased foods at the market. We do see that this value is larger among the marketing contracts, not significant, and it doesn't seem to compensate for the difference. And this can be explained if we look at the production diversity of all crops, so not just the commercial crops we were looking at earlier, but all crops produced. We do see that the households under the marketing contract have a much lower production diversity, also at the home garden level, not just at the commercial level, which is consistent with what we find before of like a transition of labor out of agricultural production and towards off-farm employment. And the next interesting thing here among the home garden production diversity is that although the farmers under the resource providing contract have specialized strongly at the commercial level, we do observe that it's indicated that they might have diversified at the home garden level. And that is quite an interesting finding. And this might also be an indication that the saved female labor time is now invested at the homestead for home gardening, nutrition, and cooking, and so on. And the next two rows support these labor findings because they show that under the resource providing contracts, we have about a 2.6 labor days per year per female household members for the cultivation of oil palm, where for the marketing contract, we see a little bit above 5 working days. And for the comparison farmers, we see almost 20 labor days per female household member. So we have the strongest labor saving under the resource providing contract per female household member. And we do see in the next row that we also have almost no reallocation towards off-farm employment, which I had indicated earlier was a previous finding. But we do see that under the marketing contract, the per female household member participation in off-farm employment is quite large compared to the other groups. So all of these pathways might potentially influence these difference in findings. Overall, keep in mind that there is a strong positive income effect underlying both of the contracted groups, which drives also, again, positive nutrition effects. Now, before I conclude, I want to mention a few limitations that the study has that should be considered. And the first is that, as many studies, these results are contract and context specific. And in particular, this is one of the only contracts for which in the empirical literature, labor saving effects were identified, just to mention that as an example. Then we also have a very small sample size for the individual analysis because we only had 115 children between the ages 2 and 5 and according 95 female caretakers. So a larger sample would of course help to get more robust results. And the next issue is the cross-sectional data. Due to the self-selection, of course, we would be much less cautious about the findings if we would have panel data and would be able to control for those. Nevertheless, we've shown that contract farming has positive effects on household and individual diets and nutrition. And I believe this is an important finding, especially that there can also be differences in effect because we have different changes in production patterns and labor allocation as a response to particular contract characteristics. Moreover, a more policy relevant finding might be that gender sensitive contract farming can have positive effects. If females are actually contracted, we do see short and long-term nutrition effects, not just for the women themselves, but also for the children in the household. And lastly, nutrition is an important welfare dimension, and more evidence is needed to understand the effects of contract farming, especially because they can be so context specific. So I highly encourage everybody to keep an eye out for potential studies looking at these effects. Thank you very much.
Great. Well, super. I personally am super interested and excited about this paper. So let me please discuss this. Okay, so I will first just briefly summarize my take on the findings and make sure that I am getting things correctly. So the paper is studying the effects of contract farming on household and intra-household diets and nutrition with smallholder oil palm producers in Ghana as the setting. Specifically focusing on two different types of contracting schemes: marketing contracts and resource providing contracts, which I guess in the American context I would think of as best described by production contracts. The identification strategy leverages household surveys sampling from 9 villages that are part of the marketing contract scheme, 13 villages from the resource providing contract scheme, and then 9 villages that were approved for a contracting implementation, but that the actual contracts were not available at the time of survey. And the estimating approach is using, as Annette described, the endogenous multinomial treatment effect regressions. Some findings that I think are very interesting. So female dietary diversity is higher under both types of contracts, especially if the contracting agent is female. Household dietary diversity was unambiguously larger with the resource providing contracts. And there is some evidence that I interpreted as describing gains to female dietary diversity from marketing contracts might be mitigating household gains. So that is to say that there's no observable household increase from female agent marketing contracts, and yet we find evidence of female dietary diversity increases. There's somewhat mixed results for child nutritional outcomes. For age normalized height, we see declines for children in male agent households with marketing contracts. And so here I'm sort of emphasizing the baseline coefficient interpretations that Annette presented as describing male agent households. And we see increases in age normalized height for children in male agent households with the resource providing contracts. And we see slight increases for children in female agent households that have marketing contracts, and again, much stronger results for resource providing contracts. For age normalized weight, the results seem to be a bit more consistent. There's increases for children under both contracting schemes, more so for resource providing contracts and more so for female agent households. So I think the main contributions here are quite cool. I think the biggest and most important contribution is sort of translating between some of the existing findings in the literature that have shown there are income gains and food security improvements from contracting schemes. But from what I read of the paper, this paper is the first to really directly translate this into health-related development outcomes, which I think are a very important aspect of understanding contracting as a development intervention. So the literature is primarily considered, as I mentioned, the effects on income and food security. And so with the one exception that Annette mentioned on supermarket contracts, this work is really kind of pioneering this nutritional and health-related impact study. And personally, I found some of the potential insights into intra-household resource allocation to be really interesting and, in my view, a bit underexplored in the study. So I think there's a growing literature on intra-household bargaining and sort of household economics in the development context. This is not my literature at all, but I'm aware of at least one working paper because one of the co-authors is a colleague of mine at San Diego State, Brown et al., looking at sharing the pie. And the sort of central premise of this article is that you can have households that are above the poverty line, but within the household, due to sort of household economic factors, you can have poor members of a non-poor household and vice versa. So I think that sort of aspect is really interesting in this context because the paper really focuses on this off-farm female labor, which seems clear is kind of path dependent from your existing work with Martin, where you've looked at this specifically. But I think that intra-household market power dynamics might be equally or potentially even more important here, especially given your findings on really dramatic and significant effects from female contracting agents. So there may be sort of a bargaining power story here where female households, even if they're not a female head of household, but if they're the ones that are sort of the point of contact for the contracting relationships, that might affect bargaining power with husbands or children. So for example, female agent marketing contracts, there was no effect on household dietary diversity, but women's dietary diversity went up. And again, these are different, they're not one-to-one measures, but that it does seem to suggest that there's trade-offs happening within the family to sort of reconcile these results. Likewise, you have child height statistics that are lower under male agent marketing contracts, but higher under female agent marketing contracts, again, implying some potential intra-household trade-offs that I think would be interesting to explore. I think the implications for specialization are also quite interesting, and it would be gratifying to see a little bit more exploration and discussion of this. So the lower dietary diversity from own production suggests obviously specialization, but one sort of challenge is that the causal direction could be ambiguous. You could have households that have already specialized in oil palm production that have selected into these types of contracts, or you could have the reverse causal relationship where the contracting is itself inducing specialization. And that obviously is quite challenging in the cross-sectional survey setting. So those are kind of my just wandering musings responding to this and things that I personally find interesting and kind of exciting about these results. So now I want to talk a little bit about some things to think about, I think, in the identification strategy in particular. So the sampling scheme, you are only using, from what I understood, you sampled broadly in these villages, households within these villages, but that show up in your actual analysis data set, you're only including households that do contract within these sample villages. And then all of your counterfactuals are coming from these 9 separate villages. So I do have some I guess, questions about whether or not this allows you to credibly identify the effects of contracting. And so one sort of little thought exercise is, if we were to think about including a village level dummy, right? And so as a covariate, you have a village dummy, VIK, if household I is in village K. Well, then your contracting dummy would just be a linear combination of these village level dummy variables. And so that sort of suggests some real challenges in your ability to identify or differentiate the contracting effects from a simple average over these villages. So you could sort of think about really the contracting variable or coefficient as capturing average unobserved village level characteristics within your contracting scheme. So I wrote this up before seeing your presentation, so I was really pleased to see. That was super helpful for me, and I think that that's critical to show up in the paper, is to the geographic distribution of the sampled villages and households. That was really helpful in understanding, how concerned should I be about the previous point that I made. So that was helpful. one other question that wasn't totally clear for me was when exactly the sampling happened, especially for smallholders who are engaging in a lot of self-production. It seems like sort of seasonal harvest cycles could have a big impact on dietary diversity measurement. And so if they're sampled all at the same time in the year within like a couple weeks or something like that, that seems totally fine. But if there's any type of staggering in the sampling, whereby you're sort of crossing relevant harvest times, it might be helpful to control for any type of seasonality and when the actual survey was fielded. So to kind of get into the control units a little bit more. In my mind, any type of causal interpretation of your findings, I mean, obviously in a cross-sectional setting, that's going to be challenging, but in particular, using these other villages that have been selected by the company, what you're effectively, my interpretation of what this is doing is it's sort of requiring that the company program selection is doing all of the heavy lifting on balancing on unobservables. So you're sort of really relying on that company's selection scheme to have selected appropriate counterfactuals. Maybe that's reasonable, maybe it's not, but I think that I guess being aware of that as an underlying identifying assumption and maybe being a little bit more explicit about it would, I think, be helpful. And to that point, I'm wondering if there's any type of balancing diagnostics that can be performed on unobservables, or even given the fact that you have this these latent factors that arise from your estimation, whether or not there's any evidence that these latent factors you could balance on. I guess that doesn't really work because of the whole endogeneity correction issue, but whether or not you can perform any diagnostics to show evidence of appropriate counterfactuals in your control units. And in your talk, you suggested that you had done that. I just didn't see it in the paper. So the stated motivations for not using untreated households in treated villages is about bias reduction from potential spillovers. And so one of the examples you gave in the paper was that, for example, infrastructure investment by contracting companies could really be biasing the nutritional outcomes in untreated units. And so if that's a valid concern, I would also wonder if we can separately identify these kind of contracting effects from potential infrastructure effects, even on treated units. And you can imagine sort of a causal directed acyclical graph, that you use in sort of backdoor criteria or instrumental variables approaches. And you have a sort of challenge in identification coming through this uncontrolled confounding variable, even in your experimental setting as it stands. Another issue that you point out is that the uncontracted household might be benefiting from sort of neighbor or spillover effects, whereby they can indirectly take advantage of contracting. And I would say that this to me isn't a super compelling reason not to use this approach. Worst case, you find nothing. So this would be biasing your identified effects to zero, depending on how problematic this is. And so really it would be a conservative estimate. So I think, provided I interpreted the sampling correctly and you do actually have access to non-contracted units in contracting villages, this would be at the very least a helpful additional analysis to show, even if you show no effects, that's still, I think, helpful for readers to see. And in part because we have another sort of similar type of experimental setting, Miemken and Bellmer, 2020, which uses similar cross-sectional survey data, but they're using sort of the approach that I have in mind, whereby you have some kind of region fixed effect. And so then your estimated coefficients are sort of within region contract participation effects. And so what you're able to do is you're able to kind of, to some extent, control some of the unobservable local effects that I think are challenging. So I think that this might be a bit more more credible, or at least a complementary identification strategy to consider. And that's all my comments. Again, I think this is very cool, and I don't use survey data. I think it's very, very cool, but it always has some serious limitations for causal inference because of all of these confounding issues. But super cool, super exciting, and I really appreciate the opportunity to read it and review it. If anybody has any questions, please jump in.
I have a quick question. Can you hear me?
Yeah, go for it, Steve.
Okay. So the comparison regions that were chosen, the 9 comparison regions, so the companies they've already designed contracts to be used in the future in those regions. Is that right?
Yes, so it's a marketing contract that has been designed that is very similar to the marketing contract we have in one of the regions. And the Ministry of Food and Agriculture in that region, or in general, the ministry who then told the contract term scheme to go to the local offices, they actually identified these villages with the contract farming scheme who assisted to them and ensured that that would be a suitable region. So we worked with the Ministry of Food and Agriculture, who then again worked with the contractors.
Okay, and you said the contract that's going to be used in these new regions, they're almost identical to the current contract that's in use in the treated villages?
To the marketing contract.
Just the marketing contracts.
Yes, just the marketing contract. So they, each company generally offers just one type of contract to the independent farmers. They all have a bigger variety of types of arrangement for block farmers who produce on company land under certain arrangements. But for the independent producers who produce with contracts, we find generally just resource providing ones or marketing ones. And this would also have become or will become a marketing contract.
Oh, I see. Okay. So the comparison villages didn't contain any, there were no resource contracts that were potentially being offered. I see.
No, yeah.
Okay. I'm wondering if, are the marketing contracts, they're informal contracts, right?
Yes, they are. Sorry?
Go ahead.
I interrupted you too soon. Did you want to say something else?
Oh, no, I was just saying that
okay.
the marketing contracts are informal, but the resource contracts are formal, correct?
Yes, that's a big difference between the two types of contracts that we have. Also, because their marketing contracts are short-term, they're informal. A lot of it is based on trust because they keep participating in the contract farming scheme because they realize that they are benefiting from it, and they continue participating because they have not made negative experience with the contracting company. Whereas for the resource providing contracts, farmers are bound into a formal contract for 20 to 25 years.
Oh, wow.
So there is actually no exiting for the farmers, and they have made their participation decision once and now cannot withdraw them because it's a long-term contract.
That's really interesting. Yeah. I'm wondering if there are other factors. I mean, so the key distinction you make in the two is one provides resources and the other one does not. But I'm wondering also that, the difference between formal and informal, the duration of the contracts they also have impacts on sort of the productivity of the relationship. And that could also drive some of the results as well, besides just the resource provision part of it. I don't know, I'm just thinking through that.
Yeah, no, I think you're definitely right. I think we would need a very different sample if we would really just analyze the difference of the in-kind credit provision. We would need a much larger amount of contracting companies with different varying contract characteristics. So I believe also with the infrastructure development that Clark mentioned earlier, these contract farming schemes can be looked at in a package. We did, of course, have talks with the companies, and we had talks with the village officials to see how each company was approaching villages and so on, and how much understanding the farmers had. But there are other aspects that will definitely influence these results, or do influence these results as well.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I enjoyed your paper.
Thank you. And thank you both for the comments.
Of course. One question. I wonder if you and your co-authors are considering trying to resample the villages for which you sampled before contracting was implemented. And then from what I read, I think it was a footnote, 2008 was when the contracting schemes went into effect in the control villages. Is that right?
In the comparison villages?
In the comparison villages.
No, so the villages were selected in 2018, I believe January, February, and we came in April. And I'm keeping online an eye on development, and the local coordinator also is still looking at it. And we do see that there is an establishment of the processing plant already, but unfortunately we did not see any progress with the actual contract offers yet. But we will keep an eye on that. Whether we end up going back is definitely something I would like to do, but
you have, Annette, you have to. I mean, this is like the golden setup for the experiment here, because you have a baseline for these areas. If you could resample, I mean, and you know the households, if you could resample the same household, you could, I mean, your identification power would just be tremendous. Although it would be a limited geographic scope, you could net out all of these concerns that are going to kind of follow you around with the cross-sectional approach. But anyway,
it would be also interesting to see which one of these control farmers actually decide for a contract. Beyond that, I mean, we can't assume that they will all self-select, but that would also be an interesting study, definitely. Yes,
absolutely. Great. Okay, well, it seems like all of us are quite excited about this. I don't think that I can deliver a compelling follow-up to this paper, but I'll do my best. So I am going to move things in a different direction, and talk about agricultural contracting and the role that transportation costs play in endogenous contract adoption. And I will apologize, Annette and Steve have heard this a million times already. I'll apologize to everyone else that this was not supposed to be a purely theoretical paper, but we have been bogged down with the timing of getting access to restricted ARMS data that we're planning on using for empirical work on this paper. So apologize in advance for the purely theoretical discussion that we'll be having. Okay. Oh, and I should also mention that this work is joint with Tristan Skolrud at University of Saskatchewan. Okay, so just a very brief background. Agricultural contracting is quite a common means of risk mitigation in both developing and developed economies. It also has other benefits, but our work here focuses on sort of the risk management role that contracting can play. The prevalence varies quite a bit across countries and commodities. And some of the growing empirical literature relatively recently has shown that evidence of improvements in rural incomes, smallholder welfare, and that just showed us improvements in nutritional outcomes, et cetera. But there's also recent work showing that this is not a universal result. So the gains from contracting can be quite heterogeneous across different empirical settings. And so in this talk, we're sort of exploring one potential mechanism that might contribute to this heterogeneity. That's not our central goal, but I think that we can speak to some of these mixed results that are emerging in the literature. And so to kind of give you a sense, I think the audience here is probably relatively familiar with agricultural contracting, but just to give you a sense, if you're not, in the US, the widespread prevalence of this across different commodities, there are some agricultural commodities in the US which the vast majority are produced under some type of contracting scheme. Others less so, but even if you look at the prevalence of contracting in wheat markets in the United States, it's still objectively relatively large. So the idea here is that forward contracting, this could be in the form of marketing contracts. That's kind of what we have in mind here. The idea is that forward contracting eliminates exposure on the part of producers to output price risk. Okay, so you fix the price in advance. And I should also mention that in contrast with Steve's discussion, we have in mind formal contracts here, formal and enforceable contracts. However, when the producer contracts and commits a particular quantity of output to delivery, it limits their ability to dynamically adjust to any future shocks throughout the production process. So for example, if output prices, or critically in our study, transportation costs, move unfavorably during the production process, producers who have contracted may otherwise prefer to have stored the output or even abandon output altogether, depending on how bad the shock was. Now, this can generate increases in exposure to production risk that have been well documented. So the idea being that if a producer commits to delivery of a certain quantity of output, and they are faced with a negative yield shock, they might not have produced enough to meet their commitments. And so then they're exposed to risk via making up the shortcoming through spot markets. But there's a variety, at least in developed economies, of alternative insurance types of programs that might mitigate that particular type of increased risk from contracting. So as I mentioned, the forward contracting commits a quantity to a delivery location in most of the types of marketing contracts we're thinking about here. And in doing so, increases the producer's exposure to transportation cost risk. So if they've committed a quantity of output to delivery at a particular location, they have no flexibility to pursue alternative marketing locations, alternative output decisions, for example, storage, or even, as I mentioned, abandoning the output. And this exposure to transportation cost risk is increasing in the physical or effective distance to delivery point. I think the effective distance here is an important point to make when we're considering this in a development context. So in a sort of really, really rural part of the world with poor infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, you might be quite close to the delivery point, but because of the really poor transportation infrastructure, this could be quote unquote far away in terms of your ability to reach the delivery point. And so then in this, with this kind of framework here, optimal contracting then becomes a question of balancing the benefits to output price risk management against the increased exposure to transportation cost risk, which we sort of refer to throughout this talk as like the opportunity cost of contracting. And so what we're contributing with our work here is that we're going to develop a model of endogenous producer adoption of contracts, and we're focusing particularly on the role that transportation cost risk and distance to market plays in this decision. And our model obtains a spatially explicit equilibrium with insights into who signs what, how much, and where. And we think that our model provides some insights and implications for contracting as a development intervention tool, and also speaks to potential complementarities in a broader risk management strategy in agricultural production. Okay, so I'm going to sort of briefly introduce how we're thinking about this and how we're modeling things just in words, and then I will briefly get into the mathematical treatment of our model. So we have risk-neutral buyers that are offering contracts that fix a sales price and a quantity of output to be delivered at a specific location that throughout the talk I'll refer to as the market. We have perfectly inelastic and exogenous buyer demand for output under contract, and we think of this really as being without loss of generality. If we had sort of upstream factors that might influence a buyer's demand to secure output under contract due to supply chain issues or something, our qualitative results would be unchanged. We would still see the similar types of insights that we're going to see with this much simpler treatment of buyer demand. And these buyers are going to offer a contract price at a level sufficient to meet their demand, provided that the contract price does not exceed the expected output price. So if the necessary or required contract price is too high, they would just prefer to buy things on the spot market. Okay, so sellers or producers are risk averse with utility over marketing profits. So what we're doing here is we're abstracting away from production costs and really focusing on the marketing decision, which is where the contracting is is relevant, at least the type of contracting that we're thinking of. These producers produce 1 unit of output with certainty. So we're also abstracting away from production risk or output uncertainty. And the producer has 2 decision stages that occur over 3 time periods. So in period 0, what we're calling period 0, the producer chooses the share of their output to pre-commit via contracting, for which only the contract price is known. They don't know what their future transportation costs are going to be. They don't know what future output prices are going to be. In period 1, the output that they have not pre-committed to contracting, they then decide optimally whether to market that immediately or to store it and then market it in the next period. And so when they make this optimal marketing decision, they can observe the prices and costs that are relevant to their current marketing decision. The profits generated from storage are still unknown at this time. And then in this final period 2, all profits are accruing to the producer, and then the profits coming from storage are realized. And there's no opportunities to continue to store the output. They can store it 1 period, and then it's sold on those future cash markets. And so then what they're doing is they're balancing this output price risk against the opportunity cost of contracting that includes reduced flexibility. They basically give up the opportunity to adjust their marketing or storage decisions in response to these observable prices in the future. And again, when they commit a quantity to delivery, they also increase their exposure to transportation cost risk. So to kind of briefly formalize this, it's a maximizing expected utility type of problem where we have constant absolute risk aversion utility. And the profits are given by the following expression here. And I'll just really briefly walk you through this because I think it gives a good sense of where the transportation cost risk is coming from. So alpha is the share that they're committing to contract. 1 minus alpha is the share of their output that is uncontracted. So of this share alpha, their profits are going to be the fixed contract price and then the realized cost of getting that output to the market that is stochastic and depends on their D distance to the market. The free uncontracted output, they then balance between cash marketing and storage, where the cash marketing is the period 1 prices are relevant, output prices and total transportation costs. And if they store, they're faced with the period 2 output prices and transportation costs, but they have a fixed cost of storage S. So the producers are going to solve this model via backward induction. So they'll solve the optimal marketing problem first, where again, contemporaneous prices are observable, but P and T in the future are not. And so solving this problem yields an optimal marketing function that's a function of how far away they are from the market, storage costs, the parameters related to the distribution of output prices and transportation costs, and these observable output price and per distance unit transportation costs, as well as their risk aversion. Having solved this optimal marketing function, they then solve the full first period problem of total expected utility, but they have these, what we might call like it's not really a best response function, but it's an optimal adaptive marketing function that's going to respond to future observed prices, okay? And so what they're doing at this stage, I'm sorry, this is a typo, this should be max alpha. Here they've already chosen the optimal marketing function. Now they're choosing the optimal contracting function. And the optimal contracting function is going to be a function of how far away they are from the market, storage costs, price parameters, the offered contract price, and again, their risk aversion. So before we sort of continue, I just want to give you a sense of what these types of solutions look like. So we solved this model numerically in order to permit more realistic distributional assumptions about the prices. So we have log normal prices to guarantee that these prices are non-negative. Were we to use, say, normally distributed prices, we could obtain an analytical solution, but at the cost of realistic price effects. So here I'm showing you the alpha star function, the optimal contracting function as a function of distance to market. And you can see that based on the parameterization that I'm presenting here, producers close to the market are producing almost all of their output under contract because their exposure to transportation cost risks are quite small. It's almost costless for these producers to get their contracted output to the market. However, as we move away from the market, producers are increasingly exposed when they sign these contracts to variation in transportation costs. And so as a result, we have a pretty abrupt decline in contract adoption moving further away from the market. Now, recall that these are effectively like demand or supply functions that we've been deriving here. We have a particular firm's contracting behavior based on where they are and these other market kind of factors. And so to move towards an actual equilibrium description of this framework, what we want is to consider the total amount of output that's supplied under contract. And that we derive that by integrating over a spatial distribution of producers. And we integrate over all of them, okay? And so we basically look at what producers located delta distance away from the market are supplying under contract, and then how many producers are located delta distance from the market. And so by integrating over all distances from the market, we effectively obtain a quantity of output that's being supplied under contract. And then the equilibrium contract price is the contracting price that secures the quantity that buyers demand from these producers. And critically, this equilibrium contract price is going to depend on where producers are located. So if producers are concentrated close to the market, it will be quite easy for buyers to secure their desired quantity. As a result, they won't need to offer as high of a contract price in order to induce producers to supply the correct quantity under contract. Instead, if producers are quite diffusely distributed around the market, the buyer will need to offer higher contract prices to induce what I'll call the marginal contractors that are farther from the market to sign. And so just to give you a little bit of a sense of what this looks like, we have some comparative statics here on a similar plot showing the effect of the contract price as a % of the expected output price on contracting behavior. So if buyers are offering quite low contract prices, not only will there be low utilization close to the market at roughly 20%, that will also taper off quite quickly, and then there'll be an actual hard boundary beyond which none of these producers over here would supply anything under contract. And so we can see the change as we increase the contract price. So what I'm showing you here is on the left-hand plot, an exponentially distributed spatial distribution function for producers. So the color gradient goes from dark to no producers to this light blue, where there's a higher concentration of producers. You can see they're quite concentrated close to the market here, where the market is the center of this circle. Here, we can see the equilibrium distribution of contracting that incorporates the spatial equilibrium contract price. And so we can see that there's not a lot of contracting intensity, meaning even close to the market, producers are only supplying around 50% of their output under contract. But we do see relatively diffuse contracting activity. So although there are not very many producers located this far from the market, the scant producers that are over here are still willing to produce some of their output under contract. And here, this sort of summarizes those two plots where this is the total amount of output that is being supplied under contract. And again, we can see that it's relatively concentrated close to the market. And here, I think this might be quite interesting from the development perspective. We're plotting welfare gains from the introduction of contracting. So as our baseline, we shut down the contracting channel. And so then producers are optimally just choosing marketing versus storage. And then that's our baseline. We add the possibility of contracting, endogenous contracting. and see where are welfare gains the largest from the introduction of these contracting opportunities. And again, they're located quite close to the market, as you might expect. So this has some development implications because the producers that are already close to the market are already better off because it's easier for them to market their output. The producers that are farther from the market have lower baseline expected utility. And so one way that we kind of interpret this result is that contracting of this variety as a development intervention has some regressive types of characteristics to it. The introduction of it is benefiting those that sort of need it the least and not benefiting those that need it the most. Here we explore how the spatial distribution of producers might affect all of these equilibrium conditions. And so here you can see the color gradient is much wider. We have producers that are much further away from the market in this example. As a result, as I mentioned, the buyers need to offer a much higher contract price to secure the same quantity of output under contract. And so you see much higher contracting intensity near the market, where these producers are supplying almost 100% of their output under contract. And you get a much broader spatial distribution of contracting activity, where you have producers that are located, 2 distance units away from the market, still producing some small output under contract. Here you can see, again, this leads to a much more diffuse spatial distribution of output being supplied under contract. And we also have some pretty big changes with respect to welfare gains. I'm going to sort of set this aside for a minute because we have some concerns that this may be an artifact. But I'll just mention that the color gradient suggests a very progressive type of policy here, where the people that are benefiting the most are the furthest from the market. Those that are close to the market are not benefiting quite as much. But again, we think that this is kind of an artifact of a modeling assumption that we've made that we're going to revisit in a second. We also consider implications of sort of asymmetrically distributed producers away from the market, where here, instead of the market being at the center of these circles, the market is located at 0, 0, so the center of this square. And the density of firms now is skewed to what we might call the northwest of the market. Now, contracting behavior, optimal contracting behavior, doesn't depend on where firms are located. It only depends on the contract price. So based on the equilibrium contract price that arises from this spatial distribution of firms, we get this type of behavior. And so the contract price is relatively high in this setting because we have a lot of firms that are located further from the market. So the buyer has to induce participation. And so we get quite large amounts of output being supplied under contracts from producers in this central region. But when we sort of consider the interaction between how much producers are supplying and where producers are located, we get some sort of asymmetries here where the largest share of output that is being supplied under contract is not right at the market anymore. The largest share that's being produced is skewed more towards producers. It sort of meets in the middle between where the market is located and where the central mass of producers is located. And likewise, with the previous plot, we have some welfare effects we consider. And again, we have potentially progressive results where these producers, these are most of the producers that are located over here. That's where the biggest benefits from contracting are accruing, versus near the market, these people aren't benefiting quite as much from the contracting scheme. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have some concerns that those progressive welfare results might be driven by a particular modeling choice that we made. Specifically, in our model, we effectively require marketing of output. So producers cannot forego marketing, even if they would do so at a loss. So that includes cash marketing and marketing after storage. And so to sort of relax this and perhaps get a little bit more of a realistic description of optimal behavior, we censor those cash marketing profits as well as the profits after storage at 0, with the idea being that if a producer has a quantity of agricultural output at the farm gate, and they're deciding whether or not to drive it to a marketing point, a delivery point, but doing so would lose them money, right? The marginal decision would be to scrap the output, right? They would lose more money if they were to actually market than if they were to just let it rot, right? And so that's the idea that we're introducing here, is that they might elect to do that. However, if they sign contracts, they still face liability because they pre-committed a quantity. So scrapping that pre-committed quantity is not feasible. They have to deliver it. So now contracting becomes even less attractive because they're more exposed to transportation cost exposure as before, but now there's an additional opportunity cost of contracting that we might describe as the value of the option to abandon, if you're into the real options literature. But basically the idea is that the opportunity cost of contracting is higher in this setting. And so again, we'll revisit this same spatial distribution of firms here. And when we look at the spatial distribution of contracting activity, we can see quite a different pattern here. So we still see, obviously, concentrated around the market, but because producers are less willing to enter into these contracts at a given contract price, buyers need to offer an even higher contract price to secure the output they desire. Okay, so as a result, producers that are located close to the market overwhelmingly want to enter into these contracts. They're going to supply 100% of their output under contract because, again, they're risk averse. But as we move away from the market, they're exposed to more and more transportation cost risk. But there comes a point that they abruptly sort of abandon production under contract. There's no producers located beyond this boundary here that want to produce under contract, because the value of the abandonment option, the ability to scrap their output, is too valuable over here, because there's a really good chance that transportation costs will be larger than their output price that they would see. And so again, that leads to a relatively sharp cutoff in the amount of output that's supplied under contract. And we see that even with a relatively diverse spatial distribution of producers, we get some, again, regressive types of results for gains from contracting, where the welfare gains are accruing exclusively to producers that are located close to the market, where they're already relatively well off at baseline without contracting. The producers that are located further from the market that have a lower baseline welfare see no benefits from contracting in this setup because they don't utilize contracting whatsoever. And we've got a variety of comparative statics here. I'm running out of time, so I won't show you all of the plots, but I will summarize some of the comparative statics that we find. So risk aversion increases contract use close to the market because producers are averse to the output price risk. But as we move away from the market, higher risk aversion decreases contract use because they're more risk averse to the transportation cost exposure. Stronger price correlations between the output price and the transportation cost stochastic variable. Higher correlation reduces variability of profits because profits, those two prices tend to move together. And so stronger price correlation leads to lower contract utilization everywhere. Higher storage costs reduce the opportunity cost of contracting. And so more storage costs lead to higher contracting usage. Higher average fuel costs lead to larger magnitude profit variation. And so the risk aversion to profit variation is what drives higher contracting use. And higher fuel price volatility means higher transportation cost risk, and so then less contracting use. And then higher average output prices reduce contracting benefits and lead to less use, and vice versa with output volatility. That's sort of the straightforward contracting mechanism. And so I think our findings here have a number of interesting implications for contracting as a development intervention, as well as its effectiveness as a risk management tool. And one potential insight I think that we might be able to glean from these findings involve implications for infrastructure investments, so reducing the effective distances to producers, as well as where buyer facilities might be located, so buyer investment in facilities. And I'll also add very briefly that the insights from our model really are valid for segments up and down the supply chain. I've sort of framed my discussion today around primary producers, farmers or smallholders, and processing facilities. But this really could be any type of segment up and down the supply chain where these types of contracts are present. And so to very briefly conclude, our future work is really focused on empirical work here. We'll be using USDA ARMS data with spatially explicit information on contract utilization across the US. And we want to construct some descriptive exercises on the distribution, spatial distribution of contracting use, and then get at some causal identification of the effects of transportation costs on contracting using local and state level variation in fuel prices, as well as exogenous changes from policy related to gas taxes or ethanol subsidies. And so that's what I have for today.
Okay, are my slides on screen?
They are.
Okay, great. So thank you, Clark and Tristan. I thought this paper was really interesting, and you guys just did a great job modeling. I thought, you know, it's one of those models that I'd like to share with my grad students because it's parsimonious and generate lots of intuitive insights without sort of too much machinery. You know, so I thought it was just the perfect level of complexity, and it was excellent. So let me just quickly, hold on for a second. For some reason, I'm not scrolling again. So, okay. So let me just quickly summarize the paper as I understand it so that we make sure that we're all on the same page here. So this paper basically models endogenous contracting decisions of a producer who must manage both output price risk and transportation cost risk. And the key rationale here is that some producers have to decide whether to contract their outputs. And the reason why they contract is because the benefit is that output price risk is managed, obviously. But the problem is that this reduces flexibility on the part for the producer because the producer is now committed to deliver even if input costs rise, which could make it potentially very costly and difficult for them to deliver in the case of an unfavorable shock. And transportation costs are sorry about that. Transportation costs are particularly interesting because they're more difficult to hedge than maybe other input costs. And so it's important to model this trade-off, for instance. So the key question is, what proportion of output should the producer contract and what proportion should be marketed or stored to balance both output and input price risk, okay? And so the key contributions I see it is the role of transportation costs. Well, basically the role of transportation cost risk has only received limited attention in the literature on contracting. So this is sort of a novel kind of insight that transportation costs are not trivial, whereas most papers sort of hand wave it away. Okay, so this actually sort of makes this a centerpiece of the analysis, which I think is really important. The main results are basically the model was developed and then numerically solved to generate the following results. And basically the proportion of contracted output is decreasing in distance to the market. Essentially what's happening is that transportation costs become relatively more important the further the producer is from the delivery location. So even risk-averse producers may avoid contracts because the transportation cost risk starts to dominate the output price risk. And then of course, other factors like, you know, the volatility of transportation costs will also affect the degree to which producers contract. And then for risk-averse producer, signing a contract will reduce total risk if transportation costs are small enough. All right. And then finally, if output price and transportation costs are positively correlated, then contracting decreases further because the market already offers a natural hedge in that situation. But what happens is if you contract, that actually fixes the output price and kind of takes away that hedge. Okay, so that was, I thought, a nice insight as well. So what I really liked about the paper, as I said earlier, is that I really like the modeling. It's very parsimonious, it's very transparent, and the results are very intuitive and believable and based on sort of very solid, sound economic thinking. I often see, especially grad students, but some profs as well, they over model things. And I think in the model becomes less transparent. And here we've got an example of something that is where everything's very clear, even though the model's sophisticated. One of the really surprising insights I thought from the model is this idea of regressiveness of contracts, where contracts are potentially benefit those producers who I guess need it the least, because the producers that are closer to market are perhaps already better off than the producers that are further away from the market. And so contracts sort of, you know, they don't benefit the people that need it the most. And I think, well, Clark did mention this a few times, but I thought this was a pretty nice policy implication that is sort of counterintuitive initially when you think about it. But once you sort of think through their model and he outlines the arguments, then it becomes obvious. And I like insights like that, where it's not obvious in advance, but becomes obvious once you explain it. So I thought this was really nice. Let's see, just some questions and clarifications. I would say I don't have a whole lot of comments because I thought the model was very well executed. The main thing I would say is, from my perspective, I thought the results relied heavily on a specific contractual form, in that the contract price is the single price determined by market equilibrium. Okay, but one of the big issues in the contracting literature is that contractual form can take a variety of forms. In fact, one of the reasons why principals use contracts in the first place is it gives them flexibility to manipulate the contractual form in a way that allows them to resolve a variety of different problems that they may be facing that the spot market doesn't allow them to solve. Okay. So the question is, what if buyers were able to design nonlinear contracts? Okay, for instance, contracts that cover transportation costs or include a premium for the farmers who are further away from the market. All right. One of the benefits there is that now you sort of take the transportation costs issue away from the farmer. Right. And now you've sort of relaxed this tension, this trade-off that the farmers have between flexibility versus input price risk. Okay. And the other benefit of being able to customize a contract a little bit more based on spatial sort of demographics is that you don't have to pay excess premiums to the farmers closer to the market, just so you can sort of expand the marginal farmer out further. All right, so the question I have is, can you sort of explore nonlinear contracting prices in your model in numeric simulations and see what happens there? All right, and perhaps even further, you can look at sort of the optimal contract with transportation costs, where you're actually looking at the optimal contract, or you design the optimal contract and you include a participation constraint of the farmers in your contract design problem and see what kind of contractual form falls out of there. I think that if you redo the analysis using sort of an optimal contract or even a general nonlinear contract, I imagine a lot of the results might change because you're relaxing that tension, right, between output price risk and input price risk. That's my main comment and concern, I guess. Is the degree to which that contractual form is driving the results. I have a sort of a minor comment, it's not a huge deal, which is, you know, and this is a matter of taste. I I tend to like analytic comparative statics without too much structure imposed on the functional forms. So, without too much parameterization. And I'm wondering if there could be sort of just some qualitative comparative statics done to sort of guide the future empirical analysis that you plan on undertaking. I mean, I can kind of see why you did the numeric analysis, because you didn't have the data for the empirical analysis, but that's just something to think about for the future. It's not a huge deal, I suppose, but just a personal preference of sorts. Because I feel like the results might be more generalizable, but with less structure imposed on the model. And that's really about all I have for now.
Great.
So, but I enjoyed the paper. It was nicely done.
Great, thank you. I'll just add that I think those are all wonderful points. We certainly plan on trying to get some generalized theoretical results that don't rely on numerical solutions, but those are just a little bit more involved, and we didn't have time to do so before today. The point about alternative types of contracting schemes is really interesting. Generally speaking, I think the modularity of our approach is really an advantage here, because if you have, say, a buyer who's committing to picking up delivery, like in the case of the Ghana marketing contracts, the mechanism is exactly the same. It's just that the sort of principal agent type of dynamics are reversed. And so then it would be the buyer who's exposed to transportation cost risk. And so there would be some effects on contracting behavior, but on the part of the offering, I think, the buyer. So I think that the insights generalized to alternative approaches, and even like say basis contracts, you might contract where the contract is affected by expected transportation costs, but at the end of the day, you fix the contract price and you're still exposed to realized movements in transportation costs, even if the contract price is incorporating a first moment of expected transportation costs. So I think we definitely want to build out some more robust treatments of contract strategies, but we feel like the central mechanism is really going to be pretty robust. There'll be sort of changes in the sort of dynamics, obviously, but we feel like the central idea is really won't go away much.
Yeah, I think that may be true, but I think you need to discuss it in the paper, right? Because I know one of the big, so for instance, if you submit this paper as a contracting paper to a journal and you get a contract theorist as a reviewer, that person's going to say, hey, you just exogenously imposed a contract. What's going on here? Right. And so if you don't defend that contract and just sort of throw it out there, you may not even get an invitation, for a second round. So I would definitely discuss that and talk about the generalizability of your results in your paper in the first round, so you don't have to sort of, be rejected for that reason.
Great. Okay, I think we're out of time. If anybody else has any last minute questions, comments for either Annette, Steve, or myself, shoot. Otherwise, we'll say our goodbyes.
All right. Well, thanks for hosting this. And Annette, I would appreciate it if you could send me your discussant slides.
Yes, I will definitely. I was also about to ask Clark if he can do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's do that via email.
All right.
All right.
Well,